You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
This is Michael Medved. Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, once said that God offers special protection to drunkards, lost dogs, children, and the United States of America. We'll explore that special protection and what it means in The American Miracle. Subscribe to The American Miracle on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, this is Matt from the Explorers Podcast. I want to invite you to join me on the voyages and journeys of the most famous explorers in the history of the world. These are the thrilling and captivating stories of Magellan, Shackleton, Lewis and Clark, and so many other famous and not so famous adventurers from throughout history. Go to explorerspodcast.com or just look us up on your podcast app. That's the Explorers Podcast.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 185, The Fall of France Through the Ardennes. This week, a big thank you goes out to Vaughn and Matthew for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members. You can find out more about supporting the podcast over at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. On a bit of a programming note, last week was the 10th anniversary of the start of History of the Great War. Over the last 10 years, I've released over 500 episodes, and I just wanted to thank everybody who is listening or has listened to one of those episodes. I would also like to send a special thank you to everyone who's been a member over that time, or left a review of the podcast online, or told anybody in their life about the podcast. You are the reason that so many new people are listening all the time. Of course, 10 years is just a number, and there are still many more years ahead. You can head to the link in the show notes to find out more about the podcast in the next year, and the triumphant return of member-only episodes over on the Patreon page for the podcast. These will be monthly episodes covering a wide range of topics outside of the narrative of the show. Currently, there are 2 new member episodes, a deep dive into the development of the Panzer III tank, and an entire episode where I reconsider some of my views on the French and German war plans of 1914, a decade after I first discussed them on History of the Great War. Again, the link to that information is in the show notes, or you can find it over at patreon.com/historyofthegreatwar. Anyway, let's get back to 1940. For the German soldiers of Army Group A that began to move forward for their attacks on May 10, 1940, the following days were a blur of marching, and more marching. Some of the men at the front of the various units did encounter the enemy, but the vast majority of the soldiers were stacked up in endless lines of men, vehicles, and horses as they moved west. The lack of roads in the region did make travel slower, although it was far from impossible, with the greatest challenge simply being the volume of traffic that resulted in some of the German plans to make their primary point of effort to the west of the Ardennes forest seem like a distant goal, but they would get there. And while this episode will, as always, take a higher level view of events, it's worth noting that the plans were only known to a very small number of men, and the vast majority of those German forces marching west on May 10th had only the vaguest idea of what was about to happen. The 1st Panzer Division was part of General Heinz Guderian's 19th Corps, and it would also be the spearhead of his forces. Within that division was Otto Gull. He was an engineer, and this is what he would have to say about his understanding of what was happening as he moved forward after May 10th. Quote, "I had no real sense of the general plan. That was for the generals, and only an outline of what our division had to achieve. We had been told the night before that all our training had been done to push us through the Ardennes and across the Meuse. That was our objective. We were given a vague idea that what we were doing was vital to the operation, and the speed was vital, no time wasting." End quote. But even if they did not know the specifics, men like Gull knew the destination, the Meuse, and it would be on the banks of the Meuse that the success and failure of the German plan would be decided one way or the other. While the men of units like the 1st Panzer were slogging towards the border, in the early hours of May 10th, the war had already started in the air. The German bomber crews were only informed of the invasion in the early hours of May 10th when they were briefed on what was to be done that day before heading to their aircraft. During the early days of the attack, the primary point of German effort for the bombers, at least, was in the north. This served two primary purposes. The first was to try and eliminate any possible threat from the Dutch and Belgian air forces, and the second was to make it seem like the primary point of German effort was going to come in the north, with the hope being that the French would believe that the Germans were focusing wherever their bombers were. So where the bombers were, that's where the ground focus would be. These bombing attacks in the early hours were a mixed bag of success and failure. They did do a good job of reducing the strength of the Dutch and Belgian forces, but had far less success against the British and French airfields that they also targeted, and they would pay for their efforts, with 126 German medium bombers and 9 dive bombers being destroyed on the first day of operations. When combined with the fighter losses of about 21, this represented roughly 6% of the combat strength of the Luftwaffe, lost in just one day. Speaking of those fighters, while their bombing efforts were heavily focused in the north, there was always a strong presence of German fighters over the Ardennes, with the hope that they could intercept at least some proportion of Allied reconnaissance aircraft. It was always going to be generally impossible to intercept them all, particularly before the widespread presence of radar, but even just a reduction of information to the Allied intelligence staffs would still be valuable. On the Allied side, their bombing forces would also be active during the opening days of the attack. Initially, there was a focus on the bridges over the Albert Canal and the Meuse River in Belgium, bridges that were critical to the ability of the German forces to continue their attack in that area. Of course, the Germans also knew that the bridges were important and had ensured that there was adequate anti-aircraft fire available to ward off any Allied bombers. The attacks on these bridges would be, in no uncertain terms, a disaster, and it would be a disaster that would repeat itself in different places many times in the days that followed. In the attacks, British, French, and Belgian light and medium bombers would try to attack the bridges, although never in large enough number to overwhelm the German defenses. They would also often fly in at low altitude, as that gave them the best chance of actually hitting one of the bridges, but this made them easy targets for German gunners. In one attack on one bridge over the Meuse, 12 Belgian bombers would arrive at the bridge at roughly the same time. 11 of them would be shot down. But at least those bombers were able to find their objectives. Similarly, heavy losses were suffered by other squadrons of Allied bombers, sometimes without even finding their targets. While these efforts were being made to the north, the German forces in the Ardennes would not be the target for heavy Allied bombing during the first few days of the advance, but there would still be a few sorties launched against them. One of these was launched by 8 Fairey Battles, a British light bomber that would, let's be honest, not serve its crews well over France. Here is the quote from the mission about the mission from the official RAF history. Quote, 8 battles of numbers 88 and 218 squadrons were ordered to deliver a low-level attack on a column in German territory marching up towards the Luxembourg border. Whether they managed to reach their target area is doubtful. The only pilot to return saw 3 of his companions succumb to ground fire in the Ardennes. End quote. This was not totally atypical of bombing raids during this period. On May 11th and 12th, air attacks would continue to be launched by both sides, with the Germans shifting their focus in the north to bombing French and British formations moving into Belgium, while the Allied efforts continued to target German formations and bridges. On the afternoon of the 12th, with the continued flow of information that German forces were pushing towards the Meuse in the south, near Sedan, French General Georges, who was in overall command of all Allied forces in Belgium, ordered that Allied bombing support would from that point forward prioritize the Second Army, which was facing the German advance through the Ardennes. However, this shift would not occur in time to prevent the crossing of the Meuse by those German forces, partially because the commander of the French First Army, General Belot, ignored the order, while the commander of the Second Army, down to the south, which was about to get hit by a German steamroller, was honestly just not very concerned about the situation, and did not even request additional assistance. By the end of the 12th, the Allied air forces were also already losing their ability to greatly influence the flow of the battle. For example, the British had 135 bombers in France when the German attack began, and after just 2 days of fighting, that number was down to 72, almost half. The attrition among all of the air forces involved during these early days was terrible, and the campaign had only begun. But it was among the Allied bombers that some of the attrition was the worst. While the battle in the air continued, on the ground the attack would begin in the early hours of May 10th, with the target not being France, but instead the tiny country of Luxembourg. Moving through Luxembourg was always going to be an important part of the German attack, and it occupied about half of the front that Army Group A was going to move through as it went towards France. So capturing roads in Luxembourg was important for two reasons. The first was simple, so that the units that were going to move through to attack France could move through quickly. The second was wrapped around the German concerns about the Maginot Line. As the German plans developed in the weeks and months before May 10th, there was real concern that as the German noble forces pushed west across the Meuse, the French would mount a major attack against their southern flank from their positions in the Maginot Line. The attack was designed to skirt around the northern edge of the Maginot Line, and so the German 16th Army, under the command of General Busch, was dedicated to guarding against the possibility of a French attack from the south. It would also be Busch's forces that would play the primary role in the opening attacks on Luxembourg. To try and ensure that the attack went smoothly, the plan called for, once again, an airborne attack, something that Busch was not really a big fan of. He instead wanted to use two fast motorized forces to quickly move into Luxembourg and capture all the major points of concern as quickly as possible, but on the ground. Hitler and others felt that there was a risk with this plan due to the relatively small number of roads available for such an operation. If these roads were blocked or the motorized forces were slowed down, it might give the French and Belgians time to react, and so their solution was an airborne attack. However, with most of the German airborne troops, and more importantly transport aircraft, occupied in Belgium and in the Netherlands, the airborne attacks in Luxembourg would be a bit different. Instead of utilizing the workhorse transport aircraft of the Luftwaffe, the Ju-52, these attacks would instead use the Fischler Stork Fi-156. I am generally a fan of how most aircraft look. I think most aircraft just generally look good. But the Stork is not one of those aircraft. It is small, ugly, oddly shaped, but each aircraft could carry a handful of men, and they were really, really good for what was about to happen. They would transport small units of men to critical points throughout Luxembourg, which they would then hold while the mobile units under Busch sort of moved as quickly as possible to reinforce them. This operation would begin just after 4 a.m. on the 10th, when 25 Storks took off from their airfields. They would make multiple trips to bring in more and more men over the following hours, and the operation would be basically entirely successful, with no real resistance from the Luxembourg border guards and a complete lack of resistance from the French, who weren't even in Luxembourg yet. There were French forces posted and sort of positioned to move into Luxembourg, as it was well understood that the Germans would almost certainly move through the country. But much like with Belgium, they could not move into Luxembourg first due to Luxembourg's neutrality. This meant that the French plan was to wait for the German attack and then quickly move French cavalry forces forward to slow and maybe even stop the German advance before it reached the French border. Two things would go wrong with this plan right from the start. The first was that a large number of the men in those units were on leave, or were at least away from their units, due to a lengthy period of high alert that had occurred just a few weeks earlier in April. After this period of high alert, there was a greater than average number of men sent on leave. The men that were there were also dispersed quite widely throughout the area. This greatly reduced their ability to quickly move and concentrate the forces that needed to move into Luxembourg. The second problem was due to how long it took them to receive orders to move. Even though reports began arriving almost immediately after the German attack began, it would not be until almost 7 a.m., almost 3 hours after the attack started, that orders would arrive for French forces to move forward. This gave them very little time to establish themselves in Luxembourg before they were being pushed back by the German forces in front of them. They were heavily outnumbered, and so their only hope was to establish strong blocking positions where the advantage provided by German numbers and firepower could be reduced. But they never had a chance to put these plans into place. Many of the German troops would not even encounter any resistance before they reached the Belgian and French border on the other side of Luxembourg.
All you need is a few minutes to start your day off with something historic when you listen to the This Day in History podcast. Every day there's a new episode for you to listen and learn about what happened that day way back when. Today could be the day a famous mobster met their end, or the first milestone for humans in space. Who knows what history today holds? Find out when you listen and subscribe to This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts. That's This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts.
Some of us love history. Others used to or never did because history was presented as nothing but the rote memorization of names, dates, and facts. Basically, the story got left out, and that made history kind of suck. My name is Greg Jackson. I'm a university professor with a PhD in history, and bringing history to life is my passion. That's why I created my podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. I want to teach you everything you need to know about U.S. history, but I do so through stories. Let me tell you about George Washington begging his men not to mutiny against Congress, Clara Barton saving Union soldiers amid enemy fire, enslaved Frederick Douglass risking his life for liberty, and about so many other figures as their real experiences make industrialization, social movements, and even congressional debates and tax policy come to life. Subscribe to History That Doesn't Suck today, and join me, Professor Greg Jackson, every other week for a new episode, where I'd like to tell you a story.
The quick capture of Luxembourg was critical because it helped to unlock Panzer Group Kleist for its move west. The forces under Kleist were the strongest motorized and armored force that had ever been assembled for an attack up to that point in history. It had 5 panzer divisions and 3 motorized infantry divisions, and then immediately to its north were 2 more panzer divisions under the 4th Army's 15th Corps. This collection of forces was to play the pivotal role in the German attack. But that did not mean that everyone saw its plan and its role as the same. When the plans were being made for how to use this very large group of armored and motorized units, the exact same types of disagreements that had occurred in Poland and would later occur in Russia were present. Exactly how should the infantry and the mobile divisions work together? In this area of the front, this was an even more important conversation because of the exact organization of the German forces. Kleist's panzer group was not given its own sector of the front and was instead set up simply as the forward units of the infantry armies that would follow. In some ways this made sense, as they could move quickly and then they would need infantry divisions to follow up and to kind of occupy the territory that they were taking, and they might even need infantry support at various moments during the campaign. However, Kleist was very concerned that the organizational structure would be used to keep a leash on how far his mobile units would be allowed to go forward. This was the great concern of almost every German armored general during these war years, and is something that is discussed at length by men like Guderian in post-war accounts. The concern was that with so many of the German generals, especially more experienced commanders like Army Groups A commander, General von Rundstedt, having a long history of infantry leadership, there would be a tendency to subordinate armored units to the needs of the infantry. This would reduce the ability of those armored units to use their mobility and striking power to achieve their objectives. Kleist would not completely remove this risk before the campaign began, even though he would try. However, he was able to get von Rundstedt to at least agree that he would have complete operational freedom in the opening phases of the attack, and he would retain that freedom for as long as his mobile units stayed ahead of the infantry armies that followed. However, this freedom of action would be removed, and his troops would become subordinated to the armies that were following them if they were slowed down by French resistance. With this operational freedom guaranteed, at least for the time being, Kleist turned his concern to the other major problem that his troops would have to contend with: roads. For the German attack, roads were a problem, and they would continue to be a problem because there were never enough of them. The lack of roads was one of the reasons that the French discounted the threat of a German attack through this area of the front, and it was a real problem for the Germans. Essentially, Kleist's entire panzer group of 8 divisions had just 4 roads to move on. This meant that his forces would, at least initially, be strung out over 400 kilometers of those roads, which was of course far from ideal. There were more roads that could have been used, but these were zealously protected by the commanders of other units, for the same reason that Kleist wanted them. Every German officer who was assigned to his sector of the front wanted to have as many roads as possible to move their troops forward so that they could achieve their objectives. To try and reduce the supply problems that would almost certainly result from this lack of roads, a few different measures were taken to try and give the forwardmost units as many supplies as possible during their attack. The first concern for the armored and motorized forces was fuel, and so they were given as much fuel as they could carry, and then stockpiles were built up right up to the border with Luxembourg. This would ensure that all the forces would cross the border with as much as they could carry to give them as much endurance as possible. Every other type of supply was also stockpiled near the border, with plans to move those stockpiles forward as soon as possible, but of course this would take time. Kleist's forces were also provided with more trucks to send forward with their forward elements, all loaded with as much cargo as they could carry. It was these forward elements that were most at risk of running out of supplies because the roads would be packed with other units trying to move forward, and so it would be very challenging to get supply trucks to them after the advance started. Many of these trucks were simply loaded to capacity with fuel cans, with the idea being that they could be placed as far forward as possible in the columns, and then they could just hand gas cans to the vehicle crews as they continued forward. These arrangements would actually work quite well during the opening days of the attack, although they would of course eventually reach their limit in the frantic race after the crossing of the Meuse. Not everything went perfectly for Kleist's forces, though. A particular problem was the movement of the corps commanded by General Reinhardt, which was supposed to move forward to cross the Meuse at the same time as the corps commanded by Guderian. Instead of being able to move forward on schedule, the men under Reinhardt's command had to wait hour after hour because of traffic jams that were occurring in front of them. This meant that they were not even close to being through Luxembourg until early on May 12th, far later than expected, but there was nothing that they could really do because of the delays of the units in front of them, and they were placed behind these units because of the lack of roads, which was of course a very well-known problem. It was not just the lack of roads or organizational disagreements that the German forces had to deal with in their advance, though. There were also French and Belgian forces in place that to, at the very least, slow them down. In both cases, the forces that were in place were given the mission of slowing down the German advance through the use of roadblocks and demolition. On the Belgian side, there were two divisions, the 1st Ardennes Light Infantry and the 1st Cavalry Division, while on the French side, there would be a total of 5 cavalry divisions and a few independent cavalry brigades. It is worth noting here, just so you can kind of get your mental picture right, that while some of these cavalry troops were the traditional horse-mounted troops, during the 1930s, a good portion of the cavalry units in all of the armies of Europe had been converted into simply mobile forces with trucks or armored cars or light tanks. There were still some horse-mounted units, and in the case of the Ardennes area, this was actually sometimes kind of an advantage to overall mobility, but that wasn't everyone. In the French army in particular, the cavalry forces were often some of the best and most modern forces, which I'm only emphasizing here because I don't want you thinking that this is an instance of troops going forward with lances against the German panzers again. These were really advanced French forces, some of the most advanced that they had. One of the challenges that these forces would have is that they had generally different ideas about what their goals were in the Ardennes. For the French and Belgian commanders, they were able to meet actually on the morning of May 10th to try and coordinate their efforts, but their differences very rapidly came to the forefront. For the French cavalry units, the goal was to push forward through Belgium and Luxembourg as quickly as possible, make contact with German troops, and then delay them as long as they could. During these delaying actions, they would retreat to the west and southwest to continue to screen the primary line of French resistance that extended north along the border. On the Belgian side, the goals were slightly different. They were instead planning on only very minimal resistance to German advances, and instead they planned to conserve their strength while delaying the German advance by destroying bridges and causing damage to roads. As they retreated, instead of moving west and southwest like the French were, they instead planned to retreat northwest towards Belgian forces around Namur. For both sides, these plans made perfect sense in isolation, and they both would accomplish their goals in the fighting that would follow. The problem was that they weren't working together. The French wanted to delay any German advance as long as possible before it reached the French border. The Belgians wanted to commit their strength only in areas where they had a good chance of success, which the isolated forces here in far southern Belgium would never have. It's possible that if the Belgians had not been neutral for those years before the war, this kind of difference could have been solved, but also maybe not. You see this many times throughout the war. The differences would never be resolved, and over the course of the days that followed, there would be multiple instances where this lack of coordination would impact the ability of both armies to defend themselves against German attacks. One of the German units that was advancing was the 1st Panzer Division, which was one of the divisions at the very forefront of the advance. Its goals during the first day were to move through Luxembourg and then all the way to the Belgian village of Neufchâteau. This would require an advance of about 65 kilometers. Due to concerns that this advance could be halted or seriously delayed by the Belgian cavalry troops that were known to be in the area, another airborne operation was planned along the route of advance of the 1st Panzer. Here again, the ugly Stork aircraft would be used, this time with 100 of them making 2 trips to place German infantry troops along the route of advance in Belgium. The primary targets of this airborne operation were Baudange and Neufchâteau. These troops were from the Gross Deutschland Regiment and had been specifically trained for this operation. This operation would not be executed perfectly. There were some issues with some fog, but they would be successful enough for the German forces under Lieutenant Garski to gather at the village of Vitry, middle of the day on the 10th. They were then able to begin their advance to their primary objective at Baudange later in that day. Vitry had been almost entirely undefended, but Baudange would be a different story, with Baudange defended by Belgian soldiers of the 5th Company of the Chasseurs Ardennes. But the plan was never for the airborne forces to capture Baudange by themselves, but instead simply to prevent the forces that were there from being reinforced. Capturing territory and securing roads was just one of the goals of the German airborne drop, though. The other was to sow a bit of confusion, and perhaps even fear, into the French and Belgian officers in this area, and that's exactly what would happen. It was unclear to the troops in Baudange exactly how many German troops had landed behind them, with reports ranging from a few handfuls to an entire airborne division. The Belgians understood that Baudange was important, though, and had put real effort into building out their defensive efforts in the town, with the Germans describing the situation like this, quote, "They were well camouflaged and carefully fortified positions of fire. The defense was strong. Everywhere there were dense and deep rolls of barbed wire. The roads and trails were all blocked. It's not possible to go around them. That would accomplish nothing. It was necessary to go directly over them." End quote. But even with these advantages, with the defending forces split in 2 to defend from both directions, and with no hope of being reinforced, it was only a matter of time before they would be overwhelmed. The first German attacks, mounted entirely by infantry, were actually repulsed due to the fierce Belgian defense. But after the German armored forces arrived from the east late in the afternoon, the artillery pieces that they brought with them sort of went to work. The last message received from the Belgian commander, Major Maurice Bricard, would be sent at around 4 p.m. He reported heavy casualties, that ammunition was running low, but that his men were defending the village house by house. They would hold on for a few more hours, but by 7 p.m. the Germans had fully cleared the area. The defenders of Baudange had been destroyed, but they had managed to delay the German advance for around 6 hours. Other small Belgian and French defensive units would also have some success on this day, and in fact the German panzer forces would almost universally not reach their opening day objectives on May 10th, but in all cases, the advances would continue the next day. For the 1st Panzer, this meant launching their attack on Neufchâteau early in the morning on the 11th. But this attack would not be a straightforward assault. The French had moved forces into Neufchâteau, and they were supported by artillery that had been positioned to support the defense. Instead of directly attacking these troops, the panzer forces that had moved forward during the night instead bypassed the main French resistance and moved further west. Their targets were places like Vormy-Fontaine, Pite-Voir, and then Biorche, which could all be reached by advancing to the south of the primary French defenses and then moving west along a road. These attacks would be very successful, and over the course of a few hours, the French defending forces in this area were pushed out of all of their positions. What happened in these cases is usually the panzer forces would attack and capture a village, some forces would stay behind to kind of guard against a French counterattack, and then others would continue west, cutting off more and more French troops as they went. The 1st Panzer Regiment would eventually become bogged down, but then the 2nd Panzer Regiment would be able to leapfrog them to continue the advance. Biorche would be reached in the middle of the afternoon, and this meant that all of the French forces in Neufchâteau were cut off from their planned route of retreat. These actions, combined with the airborne operations around Baudange, are a great example of why the French defenders would have so many problems halting the German advance during these early days of the offensive. The German forces were not just using brute force to push through French fortifications. They were inventive and reactive to what they saw in front of them. Some of these inventive attacks were pre-planned, like the airborne operations, but others were closer to improvisations on the ground, with the commanders of units like the 1st and 2nd Panzer Regiments mostly just reacting to the situation as they advanced south and west of Neufchâteau. They were benefited in this by the fact that they had greater mobility and greater numbers than the French defenders that they faced, which usually meant that they could go around and there were spaces between French fortifications and French defensive areas. This meant that even though there were some cases in which French and Belgian forces were able to delay the German advance, they were, however, unable to prevent their inexorable march towards the Meuse, a march that we will discuss next episode.